Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom with our host, Bob Olson, who will now introduce today's show and speaker.
Welcome to I Thought You'd Like to Know This Too, which is the Friday edition of I Thought You'd Like to Know, with interviews featuring many, many interesting people who have a message for you. And today, I'd like to introduce to you Donna Zuroweste, a member of the Queen of the Holy Rosary chapter of the Lay Dominicans of the Central Provision of St. Albert the Great. And you say you're in Missouri. Welcome, Donna.
Thank you, Bob.
And I'll give a little bio here. Donna currently works in the Diocese of Jefferson City, Missouri. By the way, I did my basic training at Fort Riley. You're pretty close there.
Most definitely.
As the diocese, I think it was over 100 degrees every day I was there.
Oh, I believe that. In Kansas, it gets that hot. Most people don't know Kansas is basically a sand pit.
I know. Donna currently works in the Diocese of Jefferson City, Missouri as the Diocesan Coordinator for Hospital Ministries in Columbia. A board-certified hospital chaplain, Donna oversees a wide array of pastoral and sacramental services to Catholic patients in 7 hospitals. Congratulations.
Thank you. I think.
And I'd like to start out by asking you, are you cradle Catholic?
I most certainly am.
Good for you. Tell us a little bit about your growing up as a Catholic and how things went in those early days.
Well, I'm of the generation who, from my theological viewpoint, came up really handicapped in the Catholic Church because all we were taught was to memorize the catechism. So we had virtually no scriptural background or training whatsoever, and very little theological background or training either. However, having said that, I was blessed. My mother, bless her soul, would never know what I was talking about if I would tell her that she was an extremely cosmological theologian. But she was. She taught me to see Christ not only in every human being that I met, regardless of who they were. She basically sounded like a poster for anti-discrimination because she said I was to love everybody, no matter their shape, their color, their belief, or anything. I was totally taught to respect all human beings as being kids of God. And she also taught me, most importantly, I believe, a deep foundational spirituality that Christ was in everything. So she taught me to experience God in nature, in holy creation, and that's been one of the most phenomenal foundations in spirituality that she ever could have given me. Because once you see God in everybody and everything, adding on all the religious teachings that you get in grade school and high school, college if you go to a Catholic school, then begins to make sense because you've already got that deep foundation that everything already is holy, and then you begin to learn how and why and when and through whom. And to me, that makes a big difference.
So you went to a regular Catholic school?
Regular Catholic grade school, regular Catholic high school.
And then where'd you go on then?
Well, from there, I did what every normal, I think, college graduate pretty much does. You go off and you find a job and you start working. And I ended up in...
Where did you go to college?
I went to 2 different colleges. I started off at a Catholic college in St. Louis called Fontbonne University, and I transferred across the street midway through my college degree to Washington University in St. Louis, where I got a degree in business. And then, like most college kids, went off into the business world.
Now, you say that you're a board-certified chaplain. And what's the difference between that and, say, a chaplain for a VFW hall?
Well, the word chaplain is an extreme misnomer, and many people know very little about what the title actually entails. First of all, you do have a lot of people in the community that call themselves chaplains, and they're really not. They're either ordained ministers or they're just very wonderful people that sometimes say a prayer at an event, which would be the case of a chaplain at a VFW hall. Now, by canon law, only priests can be chaplains, but that terminology is used for a priest who's in charge of a chapel. And that's vastly different from what a board-certified chaplain does. Many military people would be aware of what they think a chaplain is. At least they're somewhat familiar with the term, because they've encountered ordained ministers and or priests in the military. And they tend to think that we do that too, and then they really can't understand how a layperson can be a chaplain, because you don't have to be ordained to be a board-certified chaplain. To be a board-certified chaplain, you have to obtain a master's degree in theology, and then you have to go through a training, a chaplain's training called CPE, which stands for Certified Pastoral Education. And you do that under the supervision of a chaplain who's not only been on the field for a minimum of 10 years, but they've also gone through their own training and education process, which adds another 5 to 7 years to their life. Wow. In order to be board certified as a chaplain, that CPE that you undertake, you must have 4 units of. Each unit comprises a quarter in terms of a college degree. So once you get your certification, you've actually had and worked in 2,080 hours minimum, that's the 4-unit minimum, that is required for board certification underneath a supervisor who not only critiques who you are and what your theology is and how that informs your practice, but also whether or not you're doing it correctly, which is called orthopraxis. That's a theological term. But you've done that for a full year. You've defended who you are, what you believe in, how you do your ministry, and you've been critiqued not only by your supervisor, but you're also within a peer group of normally 5 to 10 other student chaplains of all denominations. And so you're learning about all the other denominations as you go. And when you complete that year, you should be able to stand non-judgmentally at the bedside of any patient or resident or somebody in a workplace, because we work in many different fields. But you should also be able to accompany that person regardless of what their spiritual belief is, which means you would be able to be, as I have been honored to be, at the bedside of an atheist, an agnostic, a Wiccan, every flavor of Protestant, every flavor of Native American, a Buddhist, a Hindu, a Jew, and a Muslim. And you should also be able to, if those folks want to speak to the local clergy, have the resources at hand to call their rabbi or their local imam or their Buddhist priest or their Buddhist nun or whomever it is that they would like you to call. Because unfortunately, under HIPAA laws, we're not allowed to call their specific spiritual person. They have to request it.
Now, this isn't just in Missouri.
No, this is a national program, regardless of what your denomination is. For Catholics, we're normally board certified by the National Association of Catholic Chaplains, which is the acronym of NAC. The Protestant organization is called APC, which stands for the Association of Professional Chaplains. And APC actually does the certification for all the folks of other spiritual belief systems. So there is a Jewish arm, it's the NAJC, but there is no certification body for the Muslims or the Wiccans or the Hindi or the Buddhists or the Native Americans. So they all get their certifications through APC, and then they have to demonstrate to that organization whatever it is that's required of them based on their spiritual belief system. Because, for example, the Native Americans would obviously have no educational program at the graduate level they would be going through in order to get any kind of a degree. So they'd have to work that out with APC.
Mm-hmm.
But in our particular case, as Catholics, we actually end up, depending upon the organization, only requires a 2-year master's degree, Master of Arts Pastoral Study. I, however, went on to get the entire full 4-year graduate degree, which is the exact same degree that a priest gets.
No, when you say ABC.
APC.
Oh, APC. Okay.
Yeah. Uh-huh. That's okay.
Now, how did you come to this ministry?
Well, I started off directly doing 13 years of Eucharistic ministry at a local hospital on Sundays, taking communion to the patients. The person that I did that with, because our parish believed in sending us in 2 by 2, was a snowbird, so she was not around during the winter months. And I would be alone. And so I became aware of, as I was taking communion to the patients, that more and more of them had a need to talk. That although they were very grateful to receive the Eucharist, and that was my primary purpose, function, and role for being there, what they really wanted to do was talk about what was going on with them in their current situation in the hospital, whatever that might have been. And there's nobody to do that. Nurses don't have time for that. Doctors don't have time for that. Social workers are just there to place you in the place that you need to go afterwards. So there's really nobody that they can talk to. And I thought, it seems to me somebody ought to be doing this, and I wonder who it is. And I kind of feel like I'm unprepared because I probably need to know more than what I know in order to do this really well. And I kind of just tucked that in my pocket, and I said, yeah, so what? But it was always in the back of my mind. And one day when I was making a sales call, I literally ran into a chaplain at one of our local hospitals. And I looked at him and I said, would you happen to have a few minutes to talk? And he goes, how long? And I said, I don't know. I said, I would think not more than an hour. I said, but it's kind of up to you. I said, because I'm curious about what it is you do. And he said, sure, come on into my office. And I went in and he said, primarily, he said, our first function is to listen. We listen to them as they tell their story. And then we help them to see their story in the story, and the story in their story. The story being the written word, a.k.a. Scripture. Mm-hmm. And he said, that's our purpose. That's our function. In the meantime, in the middle of all that, we help them wrestle with the emotions. We help them wonder with maybe what they might be able to do or might have to do with their family. If they're at the end of their life, what sort of reconciliation they might need, not only sacramental, with a priest, of course, but also within their family, with somebody they might have wronged years ago. He said, we help them wrestle with all of that. And I said, really? I said, so how do I learn how to do this? He said, well, you do this thing called CPE. And I looked at him and I said, so what's that entail? And he told me basically what I just told you. And I said, well, that's very interesting. But I'm working full-time and I'm single and I have a mortgage to pay, and I don't have the time, money, or energy to do that. So thanks for the information. I'm very grateful, and I walked out. I didn't think anything more of it. 2 years later,
was he a board-certified chaplain?
He certainly was. He certainly was. Okay. And at that point in time, you didn't have to have the theological degree. You could just do the CPE and volunteer, and you were in. You still had to do the paper, though. At the end of your education and your CPE, you have to put together about a 3-inch binder of who you are, your entire life's history, how you came to this, whether or not you felt called to it, whether or not you felt God's people called you to it, which in a sense is an ordination of sorts, which that really is a calling forth by God's people as well as God. And then you have to defend that, much like a thesis, in front of a jury of your peers. And they ask you all sorts of questions about all the standards, because there are pages and pages of standards that you have to meet in order to get your certification. And then they give you a thumbs up or a thumbs down. If it's a thumbs down, it's normally that you haven't accurately addressed all of those standards. And they encourage you to go back, reflect on that, come back with more answers, and try again. It's kind of like a law board. Lots of people don't pass their law boards the first time either. So you're encouraged to come back. Some people do, some people don't. And then, even after you've gotten that certification, you have to do so many continuing units of education every year. And if you don't do those, you don't get recertified. And you have to stand for your recertification every 5 years, and you have to repeat that entire process. Every 5 years, you have to put together a whole binder of what you've done the previous 5 years, all the education that you've gotten, and speak to all of that so you can get recertified. We're not just somebody in the community that says a prayer. Although, of course, we're trained to say prayers bedside.
No, Is this simply a healthcare job?
No, as I referred to when I was speaking to that, we actually serve in a variety of different arenas, if you will. We do serve in hospitals, but none of us know how healthcare is going to play out. There may not be any hospitals, or very few, in comparison to today, to be able to do that in. So we're already beginning to segue more and more into the off-site clinics or critical care walk-ins, if you will. There are a number of us now that are pioneering doing what we call e-chaplaincy, which is normally done via Skype, because some of the hospitals are already starting to do e-medicine the same way, so that they can get the care out to the person in the remote fields of Idaho. And certainly we want to be able to take care of that person spiritually as well as medically, because the medical profession has come to understand that when we're bedside, their medical care becomes more efficacious. We now actually have studies in the field of chaplaincy that indicate when the chaplain's bedside, when there's a critical issue going on, like a sudden diagnosis of cancer, or somebody suddenly has taken a turn for the worse, and they're in the process maybe of dying, even though they may be recovery, or they may come in as a trauma, a horrific accident. If we're at that bedside, the medical care is improved by as much as 75%. Now that's a very big number in the medical arena today for reimbursement, because you may not get reimbursed if the person comes back in 30 days and if you're not in the top 10% of the hospitals in your area. So if there's a chaplain there to make sure that you've got a 75% greater chance of that happening, the docs are now beginning to listen, and they're also beginning to understand that it really matters.
Wow.
So that's kind of where but because of that, we're working in all different fields in just the medical area. Then we also there are many, mostly faith-based senior centers that also employ us for the same reasons. They understand that all of the seniors in their facility, most importantly the ones who are in the care centers or in assisted living, are going through some major changes in their lives. And they need to have somebody to talk to about that, too. And their families may have questions about, what's that going to look like? Is it going to have, what's going on? Where's God in all this? They need to have somebody to help them wrestle with those questions. So that's why we're in those kinds of facilities. We also work in hospice units, but hospice places. But here in Missouri, the hospice companies are only required to have a spiritual person. In the hospitals, JACO, the certification body for hospitals, requires that it has to be a board-certified person, because they understand it's got to be somebody trained and educated to do this. The hospice people, they'll just pick up any minister or spirit or sister or anybody with no certification at all, and they don't have the tools or the education that we board-certified chaplains do. I'm sure they do a wonderful job. They probably do a wonderful job of praying, but they don't know how to do all that backstory that a board-certified chaplain does in terms of wrestling with the arrangements and what might be involved in having what we would call a good death. Have you done the memory work? Have you made sure that every member of the family has been involved? That's what we board-certified chaplains do, because we're dealing with it on a daily basis, and we've been trained and educated to do it. And then we also work in corporations. Some enlightened companies actually employ board-certified chaplains as well, because they understand, because of the stress and the tension of their industry and what their employees go through on a day-to-day basis, it would be helpful to have somebody on site that would be listening and also helping them wrestle with what those things are and how that works in terms of their family life, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the three basic arenas that we operate in: corporate, senior care, and healthcare.
Nursing homes.
We don't call them nursing homes anymore. We're trying to work everybody out of that terminology, because that very term alone causes spiritual injury. If you tell somebody that they're going to a nursing home, you can see the injury in their eyes. We call them care centers.
It's usually a one-way street, right?
In many cases, yes, but not always. It's not always. I can think of a particular gentleman whom I did my residency at the VA Medical Center in St. Louis, and we had a particular gentleman there who was actually in our hospice unit. This is one of the blessed stories that I've had in my work as a chaplain. And he had done everything. We were doing all the end-of-life issues. We made sure he was reconciled with his family. We made sure that he had gotten in touch with all the people that he'd wronged, that he was guilty about, so that he could have reconciliation around that. He'd already been coming to our weekly Protestant services. And in the middle of all that, he divulged that he'd never been baptized. And all of us chaplains looked at each other, and we looked at him, and he laughed, and he said, "I'm going to get baptized, aren't I?" And we said, "Only if that's your wish." But yes, we'd be delighted. Well, we did a full immersion in the pool.
Wow.
And within a few days afterwards, his vital signs improved so much, straight across the board, in all the measures of the medical community, that they said, "We're going to keep you for 2 weeks for further observation, but we no longer see any of those morbidities that you had before. For some nutty reason, we think you're cured, and we're not sure why, but if you are, you have no further reason to stay here." And he was not cured, because the medical community can only cure. God healed him through that baptism.
Right.
And he had no further need to stay with us in the hospice unit. He cried because he had to leave. We cried because he had to leave, because we'd all been together in this whole process for months. And all of a sudden, he was going to be with a new community. And we said, "You know what? You're going to go forth and find a new one, and you'll be happy." So miracles do happen.
I know a couple of gentlemen, too. I do something out at a nursing home here in Connecticut, out in Willimantic. And not too long ago, two of the gentlemen left. One went out to Colorado with his family, and another fellow got his own apartment. So
yeah.
So to say, it does happen. Now,
miracles do.
What I was going to. Now, did you say that you really the medical care improves too when you're on the scene?
Yep, up to 75% improvement. Yep.
Wow,
it's amazing. It's amazing.
How do you explain that?
When you treat the person, the traditional medical view of the human being, the human person, prior to, if I had to put a time on it, I actually don't know, but I'd say prior to maybe the last decade or so, they talked about only the physical person. They never tended to the emotional or the spiritual. And I would add existential, because some people think they're not spiritual. Every human being is a spiritual being. They just may not know it that way. But your existential needs, your emotional needs, your psychological needs, all those things need to be tended to. And the medical community always ignored those. Well, back when we were in a fee-based system and you got reimbursed no matter what you did, it didn't matter. Now, when you've got to be outcome-based, and you've got to prove that you've really helped the person to be healed, which they can't do, because they can't do the healing. They're only doing the curing. They're coming to understand that the whole person has to be treated, not just the physical body, but the entire human being. And so they're coming to understand that they need to address the spiritual, emotional, psychological, a.k.a. existential needs. And they're seeing the difference when the chaplain's bedside to do that. Because in some cases, I've had people where their spiritual belief was such that God was punishing them, so they didn't have to do anything because this was just a punishment from God, and somehow they were going to get through it. Well, that was their theological, their religious belief, and that gets in the way of their healing, because that's not the case. You have to do your own part. Scripturally, Jesus said, "Take up your mat and walk." He didn't say lay in the bed and say, "Well, you're punishing me, and so I'm going to take this, and that's it, and that's all." He said, no. He said, "Take up your mat and walk." So there's something that we have to do, speaking from a Christian lens. We have to participate in that healing process. Yes, the power of the Holy Spirit is going to heal us, but only after and when we're doing our own part in that process. God's not some magician that steps in and says, "Bink, you're healed." No, you have to do what the medical community is requiring you to do to be cured. Then, as long as you're spiritually in sync and your belief in God is carrying you forward and your family supporting you and your faith community supporting you, then you will be healed and you will not be back. But prior to this so-called enlightenment of the medical community, that just wasn't even on their radar screen. And now we've got the research results to say, hey, it's a 75% improvement, guys. And that really, for the doctors who haven't heard of this, that's a real wake-up call from them. But many of the medical schools are already bringing this into their educational programs. Washington University in St. Louis many of the professors there are highlighting to their students that you have to treat the whole human being. There's a little play called WIT, W-I-T, that one of the Obgyn professors at WashU has all of his students read, and it's a story of a doctor who ended up, a professor actually, who ended up getting a stage 4 cancer diagnosis, and she ends up being treated by her students, and one of her students, who treats her like a piece of meat. He just comes in every day and gives her the clinical diagnosis and walks out. And she reflects on this whole thing, and she's like, well, he treated me like a piece of meat. Yeah. Well, that's not helpful. I'm laying in this bed and I'm crying. And he treated me like a piece of meat and walked out the door. And it's a whole progression as how she moves up to her death, that this young student doctor who had been in her classes never ever listened to her, never cared about what she was, where she was emotionally, psychologically, or spiritually, never spoke to any of those dimensions, and she basically died all alone, not being cared for or loved by anybody. And this doctor at Washington University has his students read that so they understand that there's a bedside dimension beyond the body, and you can't tend to that. You need to know where that person is and ask just enough questions so that you know that you should refer them to the chaplain. And he said, in my class, I'll teach you if you don't call the chaplain, then you're going to be a lousy doctor because you need the chaplain there. And then here in St. Louis, Dr. John Morley, who's the head of the geriatric department, who's Australian, believes so firmly in this. And unfortunately, I never asked him when I was in my residency at the VA, because he pays for the residency at every VA medical center across the United States of America, because he's in charge of all of the GREC units, which is a geriatric unit at every VA medical center. He pays for the residency of a student chaplain at every facility, because that's how deeply he believes in this. He demands that there's a chaplain in his geriatric clinic at every facility. And he runs a geriatric program at SLU. Incoming medical students fight to get into his program. He is so well-renowned. My mom, when she died, her doctor had a 6-month stint under Dr. Morley when she went through her program, which I believe was 15 years ago, and that was 10 years prior. My mom died 10 years ago, so it was like 25 years ago. This doctor had 6 months with Dr. Morley. Now the students have 1 month with him. That's how much he and his program are in demand, because he's speaking to the entire human being, not just the physical. And that's important. We don't stop to realize how important that is. I can give you an example from the VA of how crucial it is. There was a gentleman who came in to the clinic, and they had a little anteroom that was where they had their blood pressure taken. And I usually tried to engage people in there to see if they wanted to talk when they moved out into the bigger room, which was far less private, held about 40 or 50 people. And this little gentleman came in, very short guy, probably about my height actually, about 5'6", and very short for a Marine, and he was a Marine. A Marine in the Asian Pacific Theater during World War II. And I could tell by the way he came in that this gentleman was really sick, and I don't mean physically, but you could just, and his whole demeanor screamed that I'm sick emotionally and spiritually and maybe even psychologically. But he wouldn't open up. He said, I don't need you. And I said, okay. And I said, that's fine. And I talked to everybody else and walked out, didn't think anything of it. Happened to be in the big room when he came in and was sitting with somebody else who said, oh, Chaplain, I'm so glad you're here. I'd really like to talk about what's going on. And so we sat there and talked about whatever it was. And he said, thank you so much for being here. I'm really grateful. And I said, you're welcome. And so I thought, we're taught to to approach at least twice. I went over to this little guy, who I refer now to as Mr. Crotchety, and he looked me straight in the face, and you'll forgive my cursing because this is exactly what he said. He looked me straight in the eye, and he basically yelled at me. Well, I came to find out later it's because he was very hard of hearing. But he basically yelled at me, and he said, "I don't need no goddamn chaplain. Didn't you hear what the hell I said before? I don't need you, goddammit." And I looked at him, and I said, "Sir," I said, "that's perfectly fine." I said, "There's nothing wrong with my hearing. I did hear you the first time." I said, "But we're a service offered by the VA because they happen to care about your spirit, about whether or not you're suffering from emotional loss or whether or not you suffered trauma in the field, and it matters to them that you have somebody to talk to about that." And I stopped. And he looked me square in the eye, and he said, "Well, damn," he said, "then I guess we can talk, honey." And he talked at me for over an hour until the doctor came to get him at full voice because he was hard of hearing, so everybody in the room heard it. I heard of his imprisonment as a POW in the Asian Pacific area. I heard of every piece of torture that he endured while he was there. I heard of how he's suffering today from all that PTSD and how he was absolutely devastated because now his health was declining. His wife had died just 6 months prior. They'd never had any kids. He had no friends because of the PTSD, because you can't form relationships. And he was totally bereft and was actually considering committing suicide because there was no reason to live.
Wow.
And at the end of that hour, I looked him straight in the eye and I said, I think he might benefit from coming and sitting in our PTSD World War II veterans group that meets every Wednesday. I said, you'd have a community. You'd have a group of people that understand the hell you've gone through, could share their experiences with you and help you give voice to that, and they'd care about whether or not you're dead or alive. And he sparkled and he smiled and he said, "Thank you," he said, "for being a pain in the ass and not accepting my refusal." And I said, "You're welcome." I said, "Sometimes there's value to being a pain in the ass." And he said, "Yes, there certainly is." And then he started crying because he was thankful. And when he left, the entire waiting room stood up and applauded. And I turned around and I said, "You guys have to explain this." And they said, "We all did what he just alluded to that you did. We all tried to get him to talk in that room. We even tried to get him to talk as he was coming down here to this room because we all knew he needed to talk, and he wouldn't talk to any of us. But he talked to you because you didn't give up." And I said, "Let me tell you why. I gave him permission to say no. He had no control, and I offered him some." Beautiful. And they said, "Wow." And I said, "Yeah, big wow." I said, "The Holy Spirit was at work." So.
How long have you been at this?
I've been doing it now since 2006. So I've been doing it a little over 11 years.
How old is this program, the Board Certified Chaplain? BCC?
It was actually started in the 50s, I believe, and it was actually started because, obviously, in the very beginning, it was all priests and maybe a few sisters who were doing the hospital ministry that they did in their own hospital systems. And they said, "You know what? It would be good if we all gathered together and reflected on our experiences and said, this is what I did. Could I have done better? What could I have done better? What do you think I might have done better? What would you have done in this? Oh, you'd have done that? Oh, gee, I never would have thought of that. You know what? That's a great idea." And they got together because they realized, the value of theological reflection. Because not only were they sharing their best practices, but they were also sharing how they saw the scriptural story and the lives of these people that they were journeying with, and how those people, with their accompaniment, were able to see then the reflection of what was going on with them in the written word. And they understood that there was value in that because they were helping each other do this better, which then enabled the patients and their families to feel better. They didn't have any of the literature. They didn't have any of the research studies. They didn't have any of that. They just realized that there was value getting together, and they said, "So let's form this group." And that's how NAC came to be. And they said, you know what? There's probably some training that we ought to think about trying to do. And so they went and talked to the Protestants. Now, I think APC was already established at that point. And they said, you know what? We like the CPE that you're doing. We see that that has value because it also helps us to name our ministry and claim it. And sometimes we have to do that because sometimes a doctor will say, oh, you're just a chaplain. Well, yes, doctor, I am. And I have a 4-year graduate degree in theology. And I've done a full residency under full supervision, a little not unlike what you've done. Do you think now there might be some value in my being bedside? Because I now happen to know a little bit about what I'm doing. And most doctors, when you say that kindly and gently, will go, wow, I had no idea. Because nobody, virtually, has any idea who we are, what we do, what our education is, or what our training is. They assume from the chaplains in the community that we're just there to say a prayer.
Now, how widespread is this? Just in the United States, or?
It's actually, it depends upon where you're at worldwide. Barnes Jewish Hospital, Barnes Jewish Christian, BJC, here in St. Louis, or here in St. Louis, I'm actually in Columbia. I keep saying here because I just moved from St. Louis, and I've lived in St. Louis all my life, so sometimes I say here when I mean there. BJC was part of one of the chaplains there was one of the very early proponents of this. And now that I think about it, the person that started this, I want to say started it in the 20s or the 30s. But BJC was one of the very first early proponents of the programs, and that was the Protestant side. So the Catholic side came late, which is no surprise because when you're ordained, you tend to think that you have everything you need, and you need to learn that you necessarily may not. But BJC started a program when Art Lucas was alive, and he was the primary proponent at Barnes before he died of cancer, had started a program in Europe and had actually, I don't know how he ended up working with the people in Latvia, but he ended up doing about 10 years' worth of training for students that came from Latvia. So there's a whole group of people trained to be board-certified chaplains in Latvia. And then from there, they belong to a European Chaplains Association over there, and they were feeding that information into the European group, who then were starting to wrestle with how they might do their own certification over there, because of course it's expensive to come back over here. They now have a version of what we have here, but the people here would call it light duty because it's not as deep as ours, because they don't have the background that we do. They don't even have the depth of seminary education in Europe that we have here. So that impetus is in Europe. How well it's currently being moved and forward, I'm not really sure, because I have no reason to be involved with that. I have heard that there's some efforts being made over in Asia as well, but exactly where and to what degree and how, I can't speak to that either. But it's my understanding that it's catching on throughout the world. But obviously, I would guess from the medical centers here, the medical universities, because using WashU and St. Louis U from St. Louis, and here in Columbia at the University of Missouri, these medical schools are drawing and attracting students from all over the world. So, I mean, here in Columbia, we have people probably from every nation in the world, just as WashU and St. Louis University both do, in St. Louis at their medical schools. And not all these people are staying here. Many of them are taking that medical education and going back home. So they're going back home and saying, well, I'm used to having a chaplain at my bedside here, and we don't have anybody like that. And so they're kind of helping push that impetus worldwide. And, eventually do I think that there will be this concept worldwide at the higher level that we have in the United States? Probably, because if you think about it, how many years ago, like 100 years ago, the medical care that was offered worldwide was not even at our level here, because their people had to come here to get the education to take it back over there to then do it and then form the schools of medicine over there to the same level that ours are. It takes time for that to all develop.
So are there chaplains, board-certified chaplains in every state in the Union, you think?
Yes. Yes. It is a JACO, the certifying body for hospitals. It is a JACO requirement that spiritual care must be offered in every medical center, i.e. hospital. Unfortunately, it doesn't require them to be board certified, but because of the strength of the three main certifying bodies, the Jewish, the NAJC for Jews, the APC for Protestants and everybody else, and NACC for Catholics, because those three organizations have really been strong in working with JACO through legislative means, they've at least gotten them to understand that board certification should be the next thing they require, but they haven't gotten that far yet. But all of the medical facilities require their staff chaplains to obtain certification within X number of years, or to have an equivalent. Because we do have a polity situation, an equal situation, where we will accept licensed pastoral counselors as chaplains also, because they too have to have theological degrees, and they have to have the pastoral counseling. So they are accepted as being equal to being board certified as chaplains. That was worked out decades ago.
Where did you say this is happening? In
all medical centers. In all medical centers. I have yet to interview at any hospital anywhere that doesn't require board certification. Now, having said that, it may not be the case in some small community hospitals, simply because they're in the middle of nowhere and they can't afford to hire somebody of our experience and education level. They may still have just a local, minister coming in and saying prayer, which beats the heck out of nothing. But any major medical center is going to have board-certified chaplains on staff, or the equivalent in a licensed pastoral counselor.
When I introduced you, I said that you oversee a wide array of pastoral and sacramental services to Catholic patients in 7 hospitals, but you say you take all faiths. You serve all faiths.
A board-certified chaplain is trained to be with anybody of any spiritual belief system at all, from the atheist all the way up to the Catholic, that entire spectrum. However, here in Columbia, the diocese here perceived that Catholic patients were not being served. Now, why that was, I don't know the whole backstory of that yet. I'm new here. I've only started since November. So I'm not real sure why the diocese felt that. But they felt that there was a deeper need than what was being fulfilled at the local hospitals. So they actually have always had retired volunteer Catholic chaplains, and I'm the very first one to have been hired full-time as a board-certified chaplain to fulfill this ministry. The University of Missouri has a main hospital and then 6 smaller specialty hospitals, and then there's another small hospital here called Boone County Hospital. And I'm responsible for the scheduling and the coordination of the ministry between the 3 volunteer board-certified chaplains that we have, the sacramental priests that do the anointing of the sick for us whenever we need it and hear confessions as needed, and then also for all of the Eucharistic ministers that do that ministry at all hospitals. And I'm only aware of the fact that there is one other diocese in the United States of America that does this model, and unfortunately I don't know who they are yet. I will when I go to the NAC convention in May, but I do not yet know who they are. But we are aware that there was one other diocese that did this model, which is unusual.
Now, were you hired by the diocese then?
Yes, I was hired by the diocese, and I work for the diocese. Therefore, I only care for the Catholic patients because that's who they're paying me to care for. But I am trained and educated to be present to anyone in any spiritual belief. And on the fly, even though I'm doing the Catholic chaplains, if there's a critical emergency where it's all hands on board and they need as many chaplains as possible, I will volunteer to serve that role because I'm needed.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the Red Cross. You don't when you volunteer for the Red Cross, you don't get to say I just want to do this. If you're an RN, you're going to do whatever is necessary. If you're a chaplain, you're going to respond no matter what the need and no matter who the person is.
Yeah.
So.
Well, because the question I was going to ask you was about how you approach, like say a Muslim to do this, but you don't usually do that. You only take action if they need it. I mean, if they ask you.
I will walk in and say, my name is Donna Zuroweste. I am the Catholic chaplain on duty today, and I just stopped by to see how you're doing. Now, that said, as I said, when you're needed, you respond. And when you're called, you respond, whether or not it's your exact focus. As an example, I met a mom and a daughter the other day. They were at the elevators as I was getting ready to go back to the office and leave for the day, and they were both standing there sobbing and holding each other. Oh. That's a critical need. I had no idea who they were. I had no idea what the situation was. I had no idea whether or not they were Catholic. But I wasn't about to walk away and leave these two sobbing because obviously they needed somebody present. Turned out they were Baptist. Turned out their loved one was in some state of disarray that might lead to death. And they had a chaplain that stopped by earlier, but who just stopped in, they said, and said a prayer. Well, that may have been all they asked for earlier. I'm the one that saw the critical emotional need and said, hey, what's going on? I happen to be one of the chaplains working here. I said, would you like to sit and talk? Well, we chatted for 45 minutes. So, earlier when the Protestant chaplain showed up, they might have just said, well, we're glad you're here. Why don't you pray for us? Which they probably gathered in prayer, and it was wonderful and phenomenal. But at that time, the mom didn't even know he was there because the person had just come into the hospital. So she was so focused on her relative, her close relative, that was all she was concerned about. She didn't even know he was in the room. He prayed with the rest of the family. So this close member of the family hadn't even received any spiritual care from the chaplain that was there because she was so focused on her close relative, she didn't even know he was there. Yeah. So I didn't undercut him anyway because when I went back to the office, I left him a note and I said, I offered spiritual care to XXX of YYY family because they were sobbing at the elevator. Here's what I did to let you know so that when you do your follow-up visit, you know that I interceded in the middle because they demonstrated a need in front of me while I was standing there and I took care of it. And when we talked to each other later in the day, he said, I can't thank you enough. I said, well, none of us would walk away from that. I said, we just wouldn't. That's not what we're trained to do. So.
Well, how about a few examples of some of the more interesting encounters you've had in hospitals?
Probably one of the most. Sure. Probably one.
That left the nursing home. You told me that story. That was very interesting.
Yep. Some of the most wonderful ones are the ones that happen in the pediatric units or hospitals because kids are just the most wonderful theologians of all, just truly amazing. And sometimes the things that happen around kids, even if the kids are not directly involved, are just amazing. I happen to be blessed to be asked to baptize a little one who was eminently dying, and in showing up to do the baptism, I talked to the family. Turned out that they were from an outstate area, and their area was so remote that they literally were in a riding circuit of their minister. So they only got a minister in their local little church maybe once or twice a year. And sometimes the people around the church would just gather together to have some prayer because there's no minister around. But they only actually saw a minister once or twice a year. So they would have no way to have a religious wake for this little one and no way to have any type of graveside that would allow them to mourn, to start their mourning journeys. And so as they were saying that, I asked them after the baptism, I said, would you like to come down to our chapel for a bit? And they said, could we? And I said, sure. I said, we have to ask the nurse. I said, because we can't go without the nurse being with us because of little one's critical status. I said, but if she'd be willing to go down with us, we could do that. I said, and then if you would like, I said, we could do some sort of a prayer service down there. I said, and we could make that with all the family involved. And they said, oh, we'd be so grateful for that. And so I asked the nurse, and she said, sure, let's go. And so we went, and first I suggested that all of them come forward and hold a little bit, which they all were able to do. And the aunts and the uncles were just touched that they would be able to hold a little bit, because prior to that it had just been Mom and Dad. And so everybody got to hold a little bit. And I said, while you're holding them, I said, maybe if not in your physical voice, maybe inside, however you feel most comfortable, you might want to talk a little bit and say hello and welcome him to the family and to the church, since we just baptized him, and I welcomed him to the Church Universal. I said, and maybe, too, you'd also like to say whatever you would like to say in the way of a pending goodbye. And so each one of them said hello, welcomed, and called him by name, and welcomed him and said they were going to be so sorry that he's going to be leaving so soon, but that they hoped he'd be their little angel and be waiting for them. It was just the most touching, moving thing I've ever seen. And at the end of all that, and I said, Mom and Dad, was there anything you would like to do? And Mom just shook her head because she could barely stand. She was so weak from her own condition, and then also knowing that her little baby that she'd carried for so long had only been out for just a few weeks was going to die. But Dad said yes. He said, would you mind if I went up to there? And he pointed up to the altar. Well, this particular facility has a 3-story tall mosaic of Jesus with the little children behind the altar. Mm-hmm. And I said, absolutely. And this young man took his baby up and lifted his infant son to Jesus, just like Isaac was lifted by Abraham. And he said, dear Jesus, please take my son home to be with you.
Wow.
And there was not a dry eye in the place. All of us were sobbing. And when he pulled his infant back down and held him in his arms and came back and laid him back in his mother's arms, the nurse made a sign that she needed to check, and she put the stethoscope on the little one's heart, and she looked at me and she nodded. And I turned around and I said, what a blessing we have witnessed. I said, because his dad lifted his little son and commended him to Jesus' loving care, that was most likely the exact moment when the Holy Spirit took him home.
Wow.
And all of us had shivers, and we sat there and talked for about half an hour. They said, this has just been the most amazing experience. We could not have had a better wake if we'd have been in a funeral parlor. It certainly would have been nowhere near as moving if we'd have been graveside. And months from now, when our minister comes, we couldn't have done any of this. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I said, you're welcome. I said, part of what a chaplain does is we establish the holy ground on which you do what you need to do on your journey through whatever it is that you're going through. And they said, thank you. And I said, you're welcome. So,
yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah, just amazing stories. Little kids that will look you straight in the eye and say, I understand that Mom and Dad are really suffering with this diagnosis that we just got about my cancer, and they're really kind of upset. But you know what? I'm not worried at all, because you know what? Jesus is right here, and he's going to be with me all the time, and it's going to be just fine.
Yeah, isn't that beautiful?
It's amazing. And then to be able to sit there as a chaplain and say, you're absolutely right. You nailed it right on the head. And just see them beam when they have somebody affirm that they get who Jesus is and where Jesus is and how God is there for us all the time. When the parents are running off trying to wrestle with the fact that they don't know what's going on and clearly are not present in the fact that God is with them, because if they were, they'd be sitting there with their little one, sharing the time they needed to be with little bit instead of running off and doing all this other stuff. So,
right.
Yep, kids are great.
So, you do make mistakes sometimes?
Of course. All human beings do, unfortunately. There are times when you walk out of a room or a situation and you stand in the hallway and you go, oh, my dear God, what did I just do? I shouldn't have said this. I could have done that better. I mean, you're self-reflecting as you're walking out the door, because you knew as you were doing or saying something, oh, heavens to Murgatroyd, why in the world did I say that? That's not what I should have said. I should have done better. Because we're taught to do that. We're taught to do that theological reflection after the visit. And we know as we're walking out of the room, holy mackerel, I totally blew that. And you feel guilty as all heck because you know you didn't do your best. You weren't fully present. And you might even know why. Maybe you only got 6 hours sleep the night before and you were tired and you really weren't fully present and you really weren't fully thinking. And you wish you hadn't done or said something. And you just stand there and you say, dear God, I screwed up. And fortunately, I don't have the capacity to kill anybody. I might have offered them really lousy pastoral care, but I can't kill them. And hopefully, if they're here tomorrow, I can go back and say or do something else that might make it better. And
That's right.
maybe even apologize for the fact that I wasn't fully present the day before. But even if I wasn't, you know what? God knows that I didn't mean to hurt or not do the best that I could have. And hopefully the family will be able to understand that she was chaplains just like any other person on the face of this earth, including priests, sisters, nuns, bishops, archbishops, cardinals, and the Pope, all screw up. We cannot and should not be put on pedestals. We can't do that. We're not perfect. We are going to screw up, every single one of us. And if we had that sense of grace and mercy in any and everything we did in our lives, this world would be a much better place.
Thomas Merton, in one of his poems or one of his songs, he says that I want to do the will of God. That's my goal. But he said, I don't always do the will of God. But the very fact that I desire to do the will of God pleases God.
Exactly. There's no question. And if we as human beings were able to offer that much grace, mercy, and compassion to each other, like I said, the world would be a better place. Sometimes people don't do that. They're very judgmental. They assume you're perfect. They go off and complain about you to administration, and then administration has to come back and say, well, what happened? And you tell them, and you hope they stand by you, because the doctors make mistakes too, and they don't abandon them. The nurses make mistakes, and they don't abandon them. And we as chaplains know we're going to make mistakes too, and we hope they won't abandon us, because we're not perfect either. And blessedly, there's no way we can physically harm the person. So we can't kill them. That's a good thing.
What does this ministry mean to you personally, Donna?
Personally, it's everything. In theology, we talk about a term called ontological. It's normally used in conjunction with ordination, but it's also used in conjunction with the sacraments, the indelible sacraments like baptism and confirmation. Once you've been baptized, you can't be unbaptized. Once you've been confirmed, you can't be unconfirmed. Once you've been ordained, you can't be unordained. You can be laicized if you choose to step out of the ministry and get married and have children, but you're still not ever an unpriest. You're just not allowed to be a practicing priest in the Roman Catholic Church. But you don't become an unpriest. It's an indelible mark that's never taken away. And that's what chaplaincy is for me. It's ontological. You asked me how I came to this. I shared with you how I came to it literally from being the hospital ministry and then bumping into the chaplain. But truth be told, I've been doing this since I was age 4. When I was tiny, my great-grandparental set had 12 kids in it. So when I was tiny, all 12 of those great-aunts and uncles started dying. At age 4, my mom, that wonderful theologian, had the wisdom to take me to the funeral parlor and explain to me that when people are dying, we go to the funeral parlor not for the person who's dead, because they're already with Jesus and they're very happy and they're no longer suffering and they're in a wonderful place called heaven. But we're there for the people that are left behind so that they know that we're there for their support. They can talk to us. They can cry with us. We're there to support them and lift them up and be with them as they're doing their grieving. And she also wanted me to know what a real dead person was like, that it was very different from being human and alive. And so she had obtained permission from whichever family member for me to go up and actually feel the dead person in the casket, so I could understand that the body becomes stone cold and it's like concrete, and that the person doesn't respond physically and doesn't respond with voice. And when they put me down on the floor, whomever the person was, spouse, I remember wrapping my arms around their leg and saying, "We love you, and we're here for you, and we will be your support," which is a lot for a 4-year-old to remember and said, but I remember doing it. And I remember the hand patting me on the head and said, "How sweet that you understand the purpose of being family at a time like this." Truthfully, I was learning how to be a chaplain because she taught me to listen. But it took me 50-plus years to figure that out. I got the word from the Holy Spirit when I was in my 40s that it was health care. And I got my MBA because I thought it was healthcare ministry, and you had to have an MBA to do healthcare marketing, rather. you had to have an MBA to do healthcare marketing. And I got my MBA, and I thought that was it. For years I tried to break into that, and I couldn't. And I didn't understand it until I met that chaplain, and I was unsuccessful being a marketing rep for the first time in my life. And when that happened, I said, "Dear God, you hit me with a 2x4. You don't have to hit me with the whole house, just like DeNozo on NCIS. I got the clue. Thank you. It's this chaplaincy thing." And when I did my first unit of CPE, I did it full time. I said, "Dear God, if you're telling me this is it, I'm going to test it. I'm unsuccessful. I believe this is it. This is my discernment of your call to me. Let me go forth now and see if your people call me back." And I did a year-long, summer-long internship for 3 months. For those 3 months, I walked straight out of an $80,000 a year plus job into a 3-month job that paid nothing. And during that 3 months' time, every person that I've visited at the senior care center where I was working as a student chaplain affirmed that this is who I am. I had a veteran affirm to me that I was the best priest, minister, chaplain, whatever I was to be called, that he'd ever met or been with in his entire life. That was God's people telling me this is who I am.
What a recommendation.
Yep. So for me, it's ontological, and it's a call not only from God, but also from God's people. And that's really what ordination is. The final part of ordination is the laying on of the hands. And the hands that were laid on my head were the hands of the patients whom I serve, as well as the families and the staff, because we minister to the staff too, especially when there's a trauma involved, to make sure that they're okay after the trauma has occurred.
How old were you when you found out that all will be well?
I met Julie in Norwich.
Oh, you met her?
Oh, metaphysically. Given that she lived in the medieval period. I first ran across her actually when I was getting my MDiv at Aquinas Institute of Theology in St. Louis. And when I read her writings, I am a mystic, and she is a mystic, and her words just touched my heart as deeply as those of Catherine of Siena and all the other mystics, John of the Cross, and the anonymous person who wrote The Cloud of Unknowing. So her mystical writings really touched me, and that's one phrase that when people are in the midst of trauma and they're just really wounded and they're really upset, they sometimes just have that look when I'm finished with a visit as if, we just need a little bit of something else. And so I often say, sometimes I will just leave you with a saying from Julian of Norwich, a mystic from the medieval period. Jesus told her, all will be well. And it's important for you to hear what Jesus said. He didn't use the present tense. He used the future tense.
Right.
All will be well. And usually they smile and say, wow, that's incredible. And I say, yes. We think the words of Jesus Christ are only in the Gospels, but they come to us in time and mystical experiences as well, if you're of the Catholic tradition.
I have something, maybe you've heard this before, but I have something for you concerning Mr. Crotchety. Would you call him Mr. Crotchety or what?
Yep.
Mr. Okay. St. John of the Cross said, where you don't find love, if you'll put love there, you'll find love.
Exactly.
You did it.
Exactly. Yep. And that's part and parcel of what we do as chaplains. Our first impetus is compassio, to suffer with.
Right.
Which is the root of the word compassion.
Well, Father in heaven, we thank you and we praise you and we glorify you, Lord, for everything that happened here tonight in our program. And you lived up to the name of I Thought You'd Like to Know This.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. As very few people know what a board-certified chaplain does, and it does not hurt for the broader community to know so that they may ask and request for our services.
Lord, bless our sister so that she can continue to do this Thank you for all you do, Donna, and everybody tonight that was enjoying this program. May God bless you. May bless you all. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.